Well, hello again and welcome to Derp your Hooves. Today we're going to talk about a little bit more basic flight and flying without flaps. Um, this is the PT-17 Stearman biplane. It's a common aircraft that the U.S. military had used to train some of their early pilots. The basics of flight for people who had never flown. So again, you can kind of see that, if you remember some of the other tutorial videos that I've made, that some of the other aircraft had flaps on the wings. And as we had learned, that flaps, in fact, can increase the wing surface area so that you can take off quicker on a shorter runway by extending the surface area of the wing. And they also can help slow you down when you're landing. So that's kind of a good thing, but what about some of the earlier aircraft, again, like these biplanes, like the PT-17 Stearman, that didn't have flaps? And they also don't have GPS or fancy electronics so how did they fly? Well, this was some of the earlier days of flight, and they learned how to do without because they didn't have. So today we're basically going to kind of just cover how to fly without flaps. So let's go ahead and start her up. But it helps when we have gas. And fuel. And again, this wouldn't be the Derpy Hooves channel if we didn't have both. So how would you slow down without flaps? Well, one of them would be to reduce the speed of the engine. You can do that by playing with the air-fuel mixture. And there are other tips and tricks on how to do that. So I also kind of want to go over in some of the earlier days of flight, these tail dragger aircraft were standard. So taking off is also different, because unlike some of the more modern tricycle landing gear planes, as it's called, with the steering wheel on the front, they don't tend to do what the tricycle or the tail dragger, planes tend to do. And you'll see this on takeoff. So let's go ahead and release our brake and give us some fuel. And it's already starting to do it. So we have to take off straight and get the proper airspeed. And again, pull back on the stick, and we have liftoff. So, also in some of these tail dragger planes, as they're called, with the steering wheel in the back, on the tail, and some would argue they're not technically tail draggers because they have a wheel on the back instead of a skid, but those are not. they're still referred to as tail draggers. So, again, I have this outline for flaps, but if I go ahead and my keyboard kind of hit the flaps, nothing. Because that's not actually a flap, that's the control surface. So, that's not a flap. And at 120 knots, I can't land this plane. It's just not going to happen. So, what exactly is it that I could do? I mean, at some point when I want to land, I have to slow down somehow. Well, one of the things that they had learned early on was that you actually have trim. Trim up, trim down.
Plane 777 leaving my airspace, frequency change approved. Victorville Tower Derp Pony plane 777 frequency change.
And setting your trim, not your rudder trim, but your aileron trim. Again, for your pitch, can actually create drag on the aircraft. And drag is something that's going to slow you down. So that was one of the things that, they knew early on, was that without flaps, you can create drag by adjusting your trim and slowing down the engine to slow down the aircraft. But I mean, there has to be other ways to slow it down so I can land it, right? So if you remember our gauges before, we have an airspeed gauge on the aircraft. And if I keep the throttle at the same amount, so let's take it to about 100, and level out. It's about level. How can I drop this speed? Well, one of the ways I could drop this speed would be to turn the plane sideways. And although it's pitching down, in fact, it starts losing speed. And you can't see that there because I've got throttle, and it's not the best way to slow down an aircraft by flying sideways. But again, I was saying, but we have pitch. So how would the pitch help? Well, let me show you something. So as we come in here towards the runway at about 100 knots, if I cut the throttle back, and I really don't mess with the trim, I start losing some speed. So maybe I just need to make a longer approach. Well, I mean, that's one way that you can land without flaps, is to give yourself plenty of room to get to the runway. And as you see, this aircraft is eventually going to stall and fall out of the sky as it loses speed because there's not enough thrust to keep it in the air. And it will glide for quite a while. But even as it glides, it generally drops in altitude. That's what gliders tend to do, unless you happen to find an updraft. So I am losing speed, and I'm heading towards 40 knots. Honestly, I don't remember the stall speed of this aircraft, but it's probably pretty safe to say that we can't stay airborne for much longer, because I am pulling back on the stick, and I have the trim pretty much set to where it was level in flight. And I'm continuing to stay at about 45 knots, and there we go. We're hitting a stall, and we would eventually go to the ground. And there's our stall that I was talking about. So let's see. Up. So here we are again, the beautiful California desert, and we just stalled the aircraft, so now you know what happens if you go too slow. Now, so as you back off the throttle, that's definitely one way to slow the aircraft. But if you're too low, as you have just seen, you just won't be able to stay airborne. And that's some of the basic principles of flight is you have to be traveling at a certain speed. And that was me adjusting the trim, by the way. You have to stay at a certain speed in order to stay airborne. If you go too fast, you overstress the aircraft, pushing it beyond its limitations for what it's built. You can damage it. Here's a fun fact, is that some of these earlier biplanes were built out of wood and canvas. And they had discovered in some of the earlier days of flight that when you go too fast, well, the wings would rip off the plane. So at one point there was too fast because airplanes don't fly without wings, much like birds don't fly without wings. Or, like if you ever knew that really cool kid, who would sit there and like pull the wings off a fly, well, the fly is no longer a fly if it doesn't have wings. It's probably more of a walk. So, wings are important for flight. Anyhow, little fun fact there. So, here you have this aircraft again, and you see what happens when I cut the speed down. That's great. You're going to lose altitude, the drag's going to increase. You're going to lose lift, and the plane will start being affected by gravity and head towards where gravity is pulling it, the ground, unless you increase your airspeed. And as you already see, when you hit stall, if you're too low to the ground, there's just not enough time to regenerate that lift sometimes. But again, as I was trying to demonstrate earlier, what happens if you're too close to the runway and you want to land, but you have no flaps to slow down, and you cut back on the throttle, and you're coming into the runway, but I don't have flaps to slow me down. And maybe I'm out of gas. So the engine's not working, right? What am I gonna do? Well, the engine's not working. So, I need to land now. Well, I don't have flaps in. Let's check our trim here and make sure that it's not set too high and it's not set too low. Okay, so it's about, it's close enough. It's at about takeoff trim. And in some other aircraft that are biplanes, there's actually a notch or an indicator on the trim lever there that lets you know that you're center. And this one, as long as it's pretty much in the middle, pretty much center, and like I said, it's a pretty crude kind of aircraft, fun aircraft. And it's yawing to the left because it's a biplane, so I'm doing a magic trick to make it stop yawing to the left. And see, actually, I'm actually trimmed a little bit too much nose down, so nose up, and there's that weird blackness that just appears out of nowhere. And right about now, I'm still a little nose down, kind of trimmed up, trimmed straight, and gaining speed. So, I was trying to illustrate that point that you can use trim and you can actually kind of counteract the trim to help you slow down. There are other ways to help you slow down. If you ever get your private pilot's license or you ever study for it, there's all kinds of information in there on how to slow an aircraft down in an emergency. And your flight instructor will teach you things like that, how to do, because, well, you're in the sky. It's only you, the plane, in the sky, and, whoever might be on the ground. As lots of people understand, you're only going to be in the sky for a little while. You have to get back down to the ground. And safely is great. It's a lot better than, plummeting to the ground without a parachute. So, again, here's one way that you can kind of reduce your airspeed, and that would be to turn the plane sideways. And we're going to go ahead and we're just going to do a quick, fast landing here. Again, demonstrating how we would use the trim. And you can also use the rudder. But how we'll use the trim to go ahead and slow the aircraft down. So trim up, stick down. There's about 0 throttle. And I'm going to do, again, it's known as stalling the aircraft. And if I trim towards the ground, I'm going to gain speed. So I want to trim up, push down to actually counter it, and just bring it in, and get closer to the runway, and continue to bring it in and get lower, and bring it in, and gently touch down. And we're rolling. And just kind of now apply some brakes very gently. And you really should adjust your trim too as you begin to land, so you don't nose over. And if you see, there we go, success. No throttle, we pretty much dead sticked it in. It's a nice long runway, so it's a great runway to practice on. It's not like the trees are at the end of the runway. And I really used no throttle whatsoever and no flaps whatsoever because I don't have them to land the PT-17 Stearman. So again, when you're flying an aircraft such as the PT-17 Stearman or other aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator or any flight simulator that don't have flaps to help you slow down, you have to learn other ways to slow down. Hopefully this was a good, helpful lesson for you, especially if you want to learn how to fly the Stearman and other aircraft like that, but you just keep crashing because you just can't slow down. You just don't know how. So, again, thanks for watching. This is Derp your Hooves. If you like what you've seen here, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share. And if you have any thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear them. So, I hope to see you in the sky.